Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining. Let me make an adjustment there. Thanks for joining me again on this Thursday to taste some more wine. Today we're doing the 2014 library release of our Merlot from the Hyde Vineyard. And unfortunately, it's only one wine, but fortunately, that opens up the time for you to ask a lot of questions. So I'm going to do like we've done in the past, is I'm going to go through and present the wine. And if you have any questions, please write them in the chat. And I have my moderator here who will text me the messages at the as we're going along, and then I'll read them in the end and try to answer them as best as I can. But yeah, let's make this as interactive and as fun as possible, and enjoy some good wine while we're at it. So, as I mentioned, this is our 2014 Merlot from the Hyde Vineyard. Doing this special library releases during this period where we're all at home trying to keep ourselves entertained. We thought it'd be fun to release some of the wines that we have in the library, and what that entails basically is, every time we do a bottling, we always hold back some wines for future evaluation, and for people to be able to dive into a wine that's been properly aged in a cellar if you don't have one of your own. So you can see what that's like as the wines get older. Our wines are pretty much designed. You can consume them when they're young, but as they get older, you start getting some more of the character in the wine that maybe doesn't show up when it's young. When wines get older, there's just seems to be a lot more to them than just fruit, which you might generally get when they're just first, right out of the gate. So anyway, 14, pretty important vintage for us. One, it seemed like it was such a long time ago, but that was the year that we had the earthquake in Napa. That happened in August, and I'll never forget. I was not in Napa, luckily. I was in Sacramento, and I kept getting some phone calls about this earthquake that had happened in the pre-dawn hours of the morning. So it was a really intense earthquake. A lot of people lost a lot of wine. We were one of the ones that lost some barrels. Quite a few barrels, and it was just kind of like the hallmark of the vintage. It started with this really big shakeup. Luckily, when it happened, there was nobody at the winery. So when these barrels came toppling down, there was nobody there to get injured. So we were fortunate for that. Other than that, the vintage was another drought year, and so the drought years basically began in 2012, carried on through 13, 14, 15, a little bit in 16. And basically what that happens for wine, the result is that we can make pretty good wine in drought years. Looks like I have an issue here with my screen wanting to go dark on me. But anyway, we make really good wine in drought years. And that's because there's less water in the soil for the plants to absorb, the vines. And consequently, we make smaller grapes with less water in the grapes. And so more concentrated flavors in the wines those years. So where it's not so good for the general public, it's pretty good for grape growing because we make really good wines when we have drought conditions. It's also a very challenging time too to make wine because if we don't have any water, we can't really irrigate or anything like that, And we tried to keep the irrigation to a minimal, but there's situations where you need some water to help your vineyard because we have really hot and dry conditions in Napa during the harvest time. And so where some other parts of the world might see rain and humidity during the harvest time, we see pretty much the opposite. Everybody kind of has some kind of water issue, whether it's too much water or too little water. And for us, the main issue in harvest time is when it's dry and hot, we get down to humidities that are 10% relative humidity. So while we're not looking to necessarily irrigate the vines, we're looking to cool down the vineyard area and increase the relative humidity a little bit, even helps, so that our grapes don't turn to raisins right in front of our eyes with this really hot and dry weather. So water is really important for the general health of the vineyard, but also the lack of water is really important for the concentration that we get in the wines. And actually, that's a really important topic. We focus on what we call stress levels in wine a lot, primarily in Bordeaux varietals. So I'm talking about Merlots, Cabernet Sauvignons, Cabernet Francs, Petit Verdot's, Malbecs. We focus a lot on water stress and water relations to the vine because there's been a lot of research, and actually the taste tests kind of prove it, that when you have high stress conditions, and we're talking about water stress, high stress conditions at harvest, you tend to make the best wine possible. So actually, we work really hard with our vineyard team to try to achieve these stress levels at the end of harvest. And so to give you a little insight into my own way of thinking, which is not just mine, but a lot of winemakers, is what I look for harvest is the vineyard telling me that it's time to harvest. And so basically what we're trying to do is allow the vine to run its course, to do its job, what it's supposed to be doing during the season. And that's produce these grapes that are ripe enough for birds to eat. And then eventually for the vine, once it's finished doing its job with the grapes, let us know that it's finished working and that I'm finished working on the grapes. And so the leaves start turning yellow and the leaves start falling off. And that's kind of the seasonality of the vine and what I look for in general for knowing that the vine is ready to be harvested. So it's a pretty long process. I was speaking about irrigation here in the U.S. and in most of the New World. And most people have come along now a long ways in understanding the approach to irrigation and the vines to have the right kind of water level there, or stress, as I keep saying. And so whereas in the past the growers would continuously irrigate out during following a protocol that every week they put a certain amount of gallons per vine on the vines, or they would just kind of flood irrigate basically. And that's exactly what it is you flood the vineyard, and they do this with other crops with water at certain times of the month for a certain frequency, and that's your irrigation. Well, what happens is when you give the vines a lot of water, they continue to want to work in terms of growing. And so they're going to grow more leaves. The canopy is going to be bigger. They're not going to focus so much on ripening the grapes and getting the grapes ready to be harvested. And so by controlling the amount of water, or maybe not irrigating at all, which is one of the things that we strive to do, you allow the plant to go through its natural process of growing, in the very beginning from this tiny little bud that sprouts these shoots with leaves and tiny little clusters, and allow it to produce the fruit and ripen the fruit to do what it's biologically created to do, which again, as I mentioned, is basically for birds to eat the grapes and then go somewhere and deposit the seeds from the grapes somewhere else so that the vine can recreate itself in a different area. That's basically what it's trying to do. The positive thing for us is that we can make wine out of this before the birds get them, and we can have a really good time and enjoy the fruits of our labors that way. So anyway, it's kind of a short spiel about water, which is really important. Water conditions this year, we were experiencing a year where we received less than 50% of our normal irrigation. So we're looking at a vintage that's kind of similar to 14 in a way. Hopefully there's no earthquake this year, but in terms of water conditions, it's pretty similar. So, these Bordeaux varietals, they're used to growing in areas where it's wet. And so some of the research that's been done has been primarily done on these Bordeaux varietals because they react to the water conditions that are just present in the environment, in the soil, and in general. And as I said, they're used to growing in an area where there's a lot of water. So as I hinted before, the more water you have, the longer it's going to take to ripen. So we're trying to really mitigate that, and we feel that these Bordeaux varietals have found a pretty good second home here in Napa because they don't have to deal with the rainy conditions as much, and they can really focus on producing ripe fruit for us to make really good wine from. So anyway, enough of the water conditions. We can speak about the wine now directly. This vineyard is in the Carneros appellation, and I've talked about this before. A lot of the wines that we've been tasting recently come from the Hyde Vineyard, and it's a pretty good testament to these growing areas that we have in the Napa Valley. It's pretty remarkable that just in one tiny region, Napa Valley, for those of you that are less familiar with Napa, Napa is a really small place, and it only produces 4% of the wine that's grown in California. The California wine is famous because of the Napa wines, and the quality of the Napa wines that come here. But it's always remarkable when you come here to really see the scope of the place and how small it is. But yet within this tiny little area in California, you have such variation in soils, and you have such variation in topography and slight variations in temperatures and weathers in the valley that allows you to create these different flavor profiles, even along the same varietal coming from different areas of Napa. So imagine this now, you go to a vineyard such as this Hyde Vineyard in Carneros, and in Carneros, it's a cooler area. And we would think that, Carneros is famous for Chardonnay primarily and Pinot Noir. But here in the same vineyard, you're growing all of these different varietals, and so it's a pretty unique ability to be able to grow varietals that, for the most part, if you were to go back to their origin in France, they're hundreds of miles apart. Where Bordeaux is compared to Burgundy, it's a huge distance. But in this vineyard, we have basically Pinot Noir growing next to Merlot, growing next to Chardonnay, growing next to Cabernet Sauvignon, growing next to Cabernet Franc and Syrah, all distinct wine growing regions in France. But here, this vineyard that's about a couple hundred acres has all of this going on. And so this vineyard also is kind of a microcosm of the microcosm that Napa Valley is. It's got these different soils and these different weather conditions. It's a long, narrow vineyard where on the front side of the vineyard, you're closest to the San Pablo Bay, so you get a little bit more of the marine influence there. It's a vineyard that experiences winds from the Pacific Ocean, believe it or not, through the Petaluma Gap coming in there, cooling things down. And it's a vineyard that's long and narrow, so as you travel from the south side of the vineyard, which is the part that's closest to the San Pablo Bay, and you work your way towards the back, you change a little bit in temperature, and so you're able to adapt a little bit the varietals that you grow there through the viticulture that you do as well. The vines don't all look the same in the vineyard. The way the Pinot is grown is a little bit different than how the Syrah or the Merlot is grown. So there are adaptations you can make in terms of the way that you grow the grapes, so that you can grow these different vines in these different conditions. So Merlot tends to be a varietal that's relatively vigorous. It likes to produce a lot of grapes, and the grapes themselves, the clusters are on the bigger side if we compare them to Cabernet Sauvignon specifically, and the grapes are bigger. So we get bigger grapes, we get bigger clusters, and it takes a shorter amount of time to ripen Merlot than it does Cabernet Sauvignon. So if you go back to France, I keep jumping back and forth as the comparison between Napa. You find that most of the varietal, or most of the wines that are made in Bordeaux, are not varietal specific. That's kind of a French thing or a European thing, that they don't state the varietal on the label as we do here in the New World. And so you go to Bordeaux, and they have these different varietals all growing in their same vineyard: Merlot, Cabernet Franc, Cabernet Sauvignon, Petit Verdot. And most of the wines are blends. And why is that? I think one of the important reasons for them is, if you look at the composition of their wines from one vintage to the next, the percentage of the different varietals of the wine, even though it's the same label, will change from one vintage to the next. So one year, the blend might be made primarily with Merlot, whereas in another year it might be made with Cabernet Sauvignon primarily. And that's because you have different lengths of time that the varietals require for ripening. So Cabernet Sauvignon is by far the varietal that requires the longest amount of hang time, let's say, for it to be tasting properly for us to harvest and to be ripe enough for us to harvest. And Merlot is has a few weeks shorter time frame that it needs to be mature and ripe and ready to go. So in situations where you have a much more difficult year, where it rains maybe more and you just don't have the sunshine and the warmth to fully mature your Cabernet Sauvignon, you might rely more on your Merlot to make your blend that year if you're in a place like Bordeaux. And so for us here in Napa, then, what does that mean? Is it's not as a strict environment for us as it is in Bordeaux in terms of the rainy conditions, but the factor is still there in terms of the dry conditions. So we really have to be careful about Merlot, because the time frame in which it ripens can be in the really, really hot part of the year for us. So, whereas Cabernet might start ripening into September, into October, Merlot is going to come in, for the most part, a couple of weeks before that. And so we really have to be on the lookout, because, again, as I mentioned earlier, Merlot is a varietal that needs water, that likes water. And if it starts getting really dry, we start making raisins directly on the vines. And so something that we want to avoid is exactly that, because you start concentrating a grape that's not ready to be harvested, a grape that's not ripe. Well, you're not only concentrating the sugar, but you're also concentrating all the other characteristics in there. So you're going to get much more acidity, because the acidity is going to become concentrated. And you're also going to concentrate the unripe flavors that are in there, that are, for the most part, in Bordeaux varietals, even the whites, you get these vegetal characters when the wine is not quite ripe yet. And so, those are the things that we try to avoid when we harvest, is not having these vegetal characters is what we're trying to do. One of the goals that we have. And so imagine, it gets to be 105, 110 degrees, and you're not careful with your Merlot, and all of a sudden it starts turning to raisins on the vine. And so you start getting just this much more intense vegetal character in the wine than you would hope for. And that's really difficult to deal with. It's not something you can readily get rid of in the cellar, and go back to your fruity character. If the fruity character is not there, you're not going to have it. You're going to have this vegetal wine. So what happens then is this wine, and I selected this particular vineyard because it's in Carneros. And in Carneros, when it gets really hot up here where we are in Yountville, where the winery is, it's going to be a good 15, even 20 degrees cooler down there. So if it's 100 degrees, 105 here, it's going to be like mid 80s down there. And it's not going to stay quite as hot for so long. So that's one way that I can avoid having to deal with situations where my Merlot might start turning to raisins before I'm ready to harvest it. And so, but the flip side of that is it takes much longer because it's cooler down there for the Merlot to ripen. So typically I'm harvesting Merlot from Carneros when we're already harvesting Cabernet from up valley. So just to give you an idea of what this weather effect does on the actual wine, it just takes it longer to ripen. And imagine Cabernet Sauvignon from Carneros, if this is coming in early to mid-October, Cabernet from down there is not coming in until close to November. So it's quite a lengthy process in Carneros for these Bordeaux varietals. But in the end, it helps me out because I know I'm not going to have to deal with these really hot conditions, like I keep saying, but also I'm going to make a balanced wine with a really nice acidity and bright flavors in it. So that's basically the gist of the vineyard is exactly that, and I'm a real big fan of this Merlot. Merlot is a really tough varietal to work with, believe it or not. And I work with Merlot in different parts of the world. And I was lucky enough to work at Ornellaia in the beginning of in 2001, the early 2000s, where we made 100-point wine out of Merlot. And that was kind of my benchmark for the longest time, was that specific Merlot, the Maceta it was called, from Ornellaia. And it wasn't an easy year there at all when we made that wine. It was a rainy September, and I remember we harvested the Merlot as soon as we could out of the rain. The wine was ready to be harvested, the grapes were ready to be harvested, but just the weather would not let up. And so it's not necessarily the conditions that you might think of to make that high caliber of a wine, but we were able to pull it off. And a couple of years later, we found out that we got this really, really great score for it. And so by that time, I had come back to Napa. And it was just really difficult for me to find Merlots here that I thought were comparable to what I was tasting when I worked in Italy, in the European type Merlots. But what happened was people started becoming, Merlot kind of fell out of favor because of the movie that brought on Pinot Noir into the world, and people just started changing their approach to Merlot. Some people stuck with it, and a lot of people decided to pull it, but those that stuck with it changed their approach to making the wine and started realizing that Merlot is not another Cabernet. So the growing conditions became a little bit clearer, that we had to do things differently for growing Merlot. And also in the cellar, we had to do things differently for producing Merlot in the cellar and making the wine, different than Cabernet. So where Cabernet is a lot more forgiving, Merlot is a little bit like Pinot, that it just requires a lot more attention. And so when we started working with this wine originally in the early, I think it was 10 or 11, I forget exactly the first vintage that we started using this Merlot. I was using it to blend primarily. And then, every consequent year I would modify a little bit the winemaking until one year it just really tasted outstanding to me in the vineyard, in the barrel. And so we decided that we wanted to make a little bit of Merlot as a single varietal, single vineyard. And I don't think there might be another producer that does a Hyde Vineyard Merlot, but we're one of very few that actually dare to do it. So we produce about 300 cases of this a year. It's what the vineyard gives us, our particular block. And so what I'm looking for is just this purity of the Merlot. I don't want it to taste like Cabernet, so you're not going to find a lot of these really fruity characters in this one. You're going to find a much more elegant characteristic. And this nose is just a little bit more on the spice side than the fruit side. And let's see what we got here. It's a subtle nose. There's definitely a nice fruit element to it, but it's not the only thing that's there. And like I said, there's a little bit more spice to it than there is fruit. It reminds me a little bit of mushrooms as well, and that's maybe the aged character. This one is produced in half of it is new French oak. It's all French oak, but only 50% of it is new. So the idea there is to keep it a non-oaky style wine, but more of a fruit-oriented wine or a spice-oriented wine, true to the Merlot character. And I think when you take the aromas in the wine, it's just these really inviting, attractive aromas. You know, there's a lot going on there, and it's kind of hard to pinpoint one specific character. But there's a little bit of fruit in the background and the spice that I keep saying. And then when you look at the wine, this is a 14, so you know this would have been 18 months in barrel, and then another year at least in the bottle. So we would have released this originally in 2017, so 3 years ago. And so you can see it doesn't really look like it has much age on it. When you look at the color, it's still a pretty nice red tone, reddish purplish tone, more on the red side, garnet. And that's kind of because of the acidity that's in the wine. So growing in a cooler area, we're able to retain more acidity, and that helps us out in the agings. And for those of you that have this wine and you look at the alcohol, you know, it's not a high alcohol wine. It's kind of an average alcohol wine, 14.5. And so having a Merlot that grows in this cooler climate, we retain the acidity and we don't get too exaggerated in the sugar content. And consequently, we don't have a very high final alcohol level in the wine. So, you know, if I back up a little bit before I taste it and tell you a little bit about the winemaking too, is I was describing that this is a little bit more challenging and requires more attention than Cabernet Sauvignon does in the cellar. And so where Cabernet becomes really predictable, Merlot is a little bit less predictable. I mean, not quite as unpredictable as Pinot Noir, but still kind of has its own demands in terms of paying attention and making the wine. And it's something where, you know, something as simple as changing the fermentation temperature has a pretty dramatic effect on what we get in the wine. So, you know, it's one of the techniques that I use, and it changes from one vintage to the next, is what my fermentation temperature is going to be. And I tend to ferment this a little bit cooler than I do Cabernet Sauvignon for the most part. Not every year. You know, my temperatures are in the 84 to 88 degree range, believe it or not. That makes a pretty big difference. It's 4 or 5 degrees that you have in terms of what you extract into the wine. And also the technique for making the wine. You know, I kind of see Merlot, I keep talking about Pinot and Cabernet. I see it kind of as a blend for me in terms of the way that I make it, not in terms of the flavors, but in terms of the way that I make it. I kind of use blended of techniques between Cabernet and Pinot. So for Pinot, I like to do punch downs almost exclusively. And for Cabernet, I do primarily pump overs almost exclusively. And on Merlot, I do a combination of the two. So I might punch it down and try to, you know, get flavors that way in the absence of any kind of aeration. And then depending on how the fermentation's going, I'll pump it over. So it's, you know, kind of a mix of different things going on different times of the fermentation to get these different flavors and aromas into the wine. So now I'll get to the taste finally. And I just think this is such a fine example of high quality California Merlot. There's so much going on in the flavor. Now because it's got a little bit more age on it, the tannins are just a lot more supple. And you taste more of the fruit. There's a really long finish, and there's a lot of perfume when you taste it. And it's just a really elegant, fantastic Merlot. I would say this is one of the ones that I'm the most proud of that I've made so far here. And that's a pretty high compliment, you know, given the fact that I had such a hard time with Merlot when I came back from Europe here in California. I think this is a really, really good Merlot. I mean, it's tasting really good now. You get some sweet fruit elements. Like I said, the tannins are soft. The acidity has mellowed out, so it's not so bright when you taste it as it was maybe even 6 months ago. And it's just got a juiciness and a savoriness to it that just makes you want to go back for another glass. So really, really fine example of Merlot. So I think it's got a lot of life left in it. This is still pretty early on. You know, it's a 14. This is 6 years later from when it was fermented and originally produced. And I think you easily have another 15 to 20 years of life. It's going to continue to change. You know, this wine was bottled with no filtration and no fining, maybe a little bit of deposits on the glass, but still the wine just looks outstanding, and it just tastes really, really good. I mean, there's no other word that I can associate other than really good. You know, that's kind of my lack of vocabulary today, maybe. But it's just such an excellent tasting wine. So I'm going to let it sit a little bit, and I'm going to take a look and see if I got any questions, and then I'm going to go back and taste it again once it's opened up. You know, one of the things that I want to make sure I pass along about these wines is, you know, these wines are built to age. The wines don't see a lot of air when I'm making the wines. I'm really careful with the aeration. If you guys saw the Instagram live that I did yesterday, you saw a little bit of the process when we move the wine in the cellar while it's aging, and how careful we are to not expose it to air. So what does that mean is the wines, they're going to show you something when you first open it, but if you wait, you're going to get a lot more out of the wine. So, you know, instead of me tasting it when I just open it, I'm going to wait a little bit and go back to it and see how it's evolved just in that short time that it's been in the glass. But in the meantime, let's see if we got any questions. All right, let's see. So from Tom Sherry, I've heard that and read that the 2014 vintage was one of the best in decades. Would you please comment? Yes, and that's a really good point. We had a series of really, really good vintages beginning with 2012. And while I really like the 12s, I really start to prefer more the 13s and the 14s and even the 15s. 15, we can talk about that when we get to it, but I'll just give you a heads up that it was a really small vintage because it was another drought year and the production level in the vineyards just dropped dramatically. So we got a lot less fruit than we expected in 15. But anyway, in 14, you know, it was the year before that really severe drought situation that we had in 15. And so the vintage just produced these wines that are just massively concentrated. And so the way that we had to work them in the cellar was to build in or bring in a little bit of elegance in the way that we make the wines. And so that's why, in my case, for this particular Merlot, I laid off the new oak and just let the concentration of the wine really show rather than bring in oak and make an even more massive wine than it could be, right? Try to bring in the elegance that way. I think it was a fantastic vintage across the board for all varietals, and pretty much every region in Napa just did really, really, really well. I think those are wines that are going to live on for a really long time. I mentioned this one has got at least another 15 years ahead of it. I think the Cabernets will last even longer, and just an excellent vintage. If you can get your hands on anything from 14, even the whites, you know, we're pouring a Hyde Vineyard Chardonnay that's 2014 that's still showing this incredible freshness. So it's just a testament to how good the vintage was across the board. Let's see. All right. Then from John, you had a neat Instagram video this week showing the racking process at Mira. Can you talk generally about what racking the same wine multiple times versus just once before bottling imparts on the flavor and texture? All right. So that's a really good question because that speaks a lot to the technique that I use. So every time we rack the wines, as careful as we are to not aerate the wines, you're going to get a little bit of air. So when you're going into the tank, you know, and you're taking the wine out of the barrels, I mentioned a little bit yesterday that there's basically two ways that you can do the racking. You can do what's called a barrel-to-barrel rack, where you take the wine from the full barrel and you fill it to the empty barrel, or what we were doing yesterday is we were taking all the barrels in the lot that we were working with and putting all those barrels, different coopers, different toast levels, different parts of France, etc., in one tank to kind of homogenize it all. And so you keep in mind that when you're filling the tank, of course, it's empty when you start out. And even though we're putting nitrogen into the tank, we have a nitrogen generator where we're trying to move out whatever air is in there with nitrogen. You're still going to get a little bit of aeration because of the movement. And you might have some air in the hose, tiny little bit. You might have a little bit of air in the tank because you're still filling it. There might be a head space once it's full. And so the nitrogen doesn't really displace all of the air. So you're going to get some aeration. The other thing too is, if you saw kind of at the end of my live yesterday, the stuff that came out of the bottom of the barrel, you know, that had a lot of some solids in there and some pasty looking stuff and things like that. I like to use that stuff as much as I can, but there gets the point where that stuff can start giving you off odors and off characters in the wine. And so that's where it's important that you start cleaning up your wine. I usually wait, if I'm harvesting in October, September, I usually wait till the following spring, late in the spring, to get going on the rackings. And that's all based on what I'm tasting and what I'm seeing, how I'm seeing the wines develop. And so, I don't want to have any of these off characters develop. And so that's why we made the decision to rack it, that particular lot yesterday, to get it off of those solids. But, there's a danger in doing that too soon, because the solids, the lees that's in the barrel, actually helps give you your wine character. So there gets to be this fine line between, am I still getting something beneficial out of that lees, or is it going to get to the point where it's going to be giving me something that's negative into the wine? And so there's only a couple of ways to really figure that out, and that's tasting it, taking one barrel. As you saw yesterday, we had one barrel that we stirred to get the stuff back into suspension and see if it was adding something to the wine at that point. And because it wasn't, we decided to move it. But I'm a big fan of keeping the wine on the lees in the barrel for as long as possible. And just, even though you're not stirring it, there's an exchange that's going on there between the wine and the lees that science hasn't really been able to explain, but it's giving character into the wine, and it's maybe passing on some things into the wine that will allow the wine to age for a longer period of time as well. So it's a really complex situation. That's a really good question. Let's see. And from John, could you share some comments on what Andy Beckstoffer had to say recently about growing Cabernet in Lake County, and how it's going to be one of the best spots in California to make great wine in 5 to 10 years? Well, he's a lot more, how can I say, optimistic than I am. I've worked with fruit from Lake County, and I worked with fruit from that specific vineyard before he bought it 10 or 15 years ago. And it's a cooler environment than Napa Valley, in terms of weather to grow. And also the soils are a little bit different. The vineyard that I worked with, which is the one that he bought, there's just a different composition in the soil, and you just get this different type of Cabernet that grows there compared to Napa Valley. So we're used to having maybe this density and fleshiness in the wines from Napa. The wines from that specific county, Lake County, they tend to be more on the lean side and maybe remind me more of Sonoma a little bit, where they don't have as much of a body. So even though they make pretty good wines, I don't think they're going to make the kind of wines that we're capable of making in Napa Valley. I think that just the overall concentration that's in the wines is just going to be a little bit or fairly less than what we get in Napa. So, not bad wines, but just not comparable to what we do in Napa is the short answer to that question. All right, let's see. From Oscar, did you implement any techniques you learned at Masseto for your Mira Merlot? So to expand on my Masseto experience, basically it was a really neat experience when I was at Masseto. I lived on the property, and where that vineyard is, it's about an hour, 15 hour and 30 minutes from Florence. The closest kind of biggish city to there is Pisa, which is still like 40 minutes away, but still not a lot going on. And so basically what happened, because we didn't have anywhere to go when I lived there, when I worked there, we spent a lot of time at the winery, and we spent a lot of time in the vineyards. And so I would say what I learned from being there was just constantly tasting the wines and reacting to how the wines are tasting to make the wine. So, there's not really a technique that I could say that I learned in the cellar, in terms of pump overs or punch downs or any kind of equipment or anything like that. I think it was more the importance of tasting and just being present during the process that to make the wine. I think that's really what I learned. When I came back, I was working at Robert Mondavi Winery, and I was the red winemaker there. The reality was much different at Robert Mondavi than it was at Ornellaia, because just the dimension of the places was so different. So, at Ornellaia, the amount of wine that we made there was pretty small, and maybe it's kind of like the size of Mira now, where we would have maybe 20, 25 fermentations going at the same time. And so it was a lot easier to go through 20 or 25 lots several times a day. Whereas compared to Mondavi, I would have 100, 110, 120 different lots going at the same time. And it was just more difficult to get around to tasting those more often than once and make decisions. So it was pretty different ball game. But for me, I would say what I really learned and appreciated was just being there, not only for tasting the grapes before harvesting, but also being in the cellar and just tasting constantly and smelling and using your senses, much more so than chemistry, I would say too, because we didn't have a full lab at Ornelia, kind of like here at Mira. We had a pretty basic lab where we can do really basic things in the lab, but for the most part, if we wanted any really hardcore analysis, we would have to send it out and wait. And that's kind of what I have here at Mira. So I really have to rely on my own senses to really capture what's going on and then justify it or confirm it through analysis that comes later in the day or even the next day. So that was the biggest lesson, is just using your senses and just the power of your own taste and smell and decision making on the wines to make the wines really, really good. All right, so the next question from Tom: since this is a single vineyard and varietal, would you consider blending based on harvest characteristics? Let's see if I understand. So the challenge, I would say, in making a single vineyard, single varietal wine is you really don't have anything to blend with, right? So if we're going to call this Hyde Vineyard in general, it has to be 95% from the Hyde Vineyard. So that means that I can use 5% of anything else from the Hyde Vineyard to blend into it. But I'm not really getting any other fruit that's complementary to Merlot, right? I'm not going to put Pinot or Chardonnay or Syrah. I'd consider Cabernet Franc maybe, but I don't really have a lot to play with in terms of blending. So the way that I blend instead is I rely on the different cooperages that I have and the different barrels that I have to make the blend, right? So in 2014, if I used some of this elsewhere, I would have selected barrels specifically for this wine based on the way that they interact together to make my blend. So maybe I would use a little bit of medium plus toe soak, maybe one new heavy toe soak barrel, and maybe the rest of them used, or something along those lines. I would rely much more on having to blend barrels than anything else to make this wine. And that's true pretty much of all of the wines that we make here, because they're all single vineyard, single varietal, except for a couple. Is the blending through cooperage becomes super important. And also, if I'm able to harvest the same vineyard twice, which is kind of rare, the grower typically doesn't want to do that. But if I can harvest the same vineyard at two different maturity levels, I can definitely do blending within the same vineyard, because I harvested one part with lower maturity and another part with higher maturity. I can play with mixing those two together in different percentages to get a final wine blend. So good question too. I mean, that's one of the challenges of making these wines is being single vineyard, single varietal. You don't have a lot of options when it comes to blending and maybe changing the profile if there's something in there that you don't like or stuff like that. You really have to play around with barrels primarily, like you keep saying. There's not a whole lot you could do. All right, so from Oscar, can you talk a little bit about the yeast that you used or use? So I can, and it depends on the vintage. The yeast, for me, I've done a lot of yeast experiments in the past, and with both white and red wines. And I find that the yeast, specifically in red wines, does not do much in terms of the character of the wine that's produced. And I can show you a book, that's got 5, 6, 7 pages of different yeasts with different characteristics of what that yeast is going to impart onto the wine. But I'm not really looking, I haven't really seen that much of a difference in terms of flavors from one yeast to another. And also, I'm not really looking for any kind of yeast flavor impartation into the wine. I'm looking to represent more what the vineyard and what the grapes taste like than what a selected yeast strain could give me into the wine. So basically, when I select my yeast, what I'm looking for is its ability to ferment and tolerate the temperatures that I work with, and also how long it's going to take to ferment. And so when I'm looking at these charts, and by now, there are yeast that I'm already used to using. I want them to be able to tolerate the up to 90 plus degrees Fahrenheit, which is not easy for a lot of yeast, because I might have vintages where we had these drought conditions and I get more sugar. I need a yeast that's going to be able to withstand higher percentages of alcohol. These are all things that are working against the survival factor of the yeast. The alcohol will kill yeast, high temperatures will kill yeast, and that'll stop your fermentation, right? And I'm also looking for a yeast that is not going to be so vigorous and ferment, in 24 hours, because I want to stretch out my fermentation so that I can get different fermentation characters at different points of the wine into the wine, right? So there's things that I like when there's less alcohol, and there's things that I like when there's more alcohol, right? So, but there's a length of time that I like to go through so that I'm getting as much as I can from each one, rather than peaking at my fermentation temperature early on and having a lot of alcohol to extract more of the things that maybe I don't want at the end of fermentation. So the yeast question is really important. Again, it's not so much for flavor; it's more for the kinetics of the fermentation, the mechanics of the fermentation that I select my yeast. So good question. All right, let's see what else we got here from Samuel. At what point do you decide to filter and clarify or not? So that's a good question too. So for the most part, I'm looking to not filter and not clarify. So I'm looking for all of this stuff to happen in the course that I'm aging the wine in the barrels. And that doesn't always happen, right? So for the most part, because I age my Bordeaux varietals for such a long time, they do a pretty nice job of clarifying on their own. And by the time I'm ready to bottle, there's a measurement that I use with one of these machines I have back here that's called Turbidity. And that basically tells you how clear or how clean your wine is. And there's a correlation between that turbidity number and sediment in the bottle, right? So if you have a higher turbidity, a dirtier wine, let's say, the chances are that you're going to have more stuff settle out into your bottle, right? Because it didn't come out before you bottled it. But I don't really let that bother me. I'm more concerned about filtration as it relates to microorganisms in the wine. And even though you went through your fermentations, your alcoholic fermentation and your malolactic fermentation, there still are microorganisms in the environment that can ruin your wine, basically. And that's when I decide to filter, is exactly that. If I feel like I'm going to have, there's another yeast called Brettanomyces that they use in Belgium to ferment their beer. And it works really, really good in beer, and I love those beers. But in wine, in certain varietals, it really accentuates this animal type character that I really don't like in Pinot Noir and that I really don't like in Syrah. And so in the case of those two specific varietals, because I don't want to run the risk of having that in my wine, and I've been in situations before at previous wineries where you do your microbiological panel and you don't detect any of that stuff right before you bottle, and then somehow magically a year later or 6 months later it shows up in your bottle and you have this Brettanomyces character in the wine. So rather than run the risk on Pinot Noir and Syrah, I'll just make the decision that I'm going to sterile filter those wines and make sure that I have zero microorganisms in the wine when I go to bottle. On Bordeaux varietals, though, I'm not as concerned about it, and I find that yeast, if it does happen, it brings like a leathery character to the wine that I find really complements some of these Bordeaux varietals. So if it's a Cabernet, if it's a Merlot, if it's a Cabernet Franc, I'm less likely to filter than I am if it's a Pinot Noir or Syrah. And then in the case of white wines, one of the other things to keep in mind is if you don't go through malolactic fermentation, which is, the bacteria fermentation that gives you the buttery character in Chardonnay, like Sauvignon Blancs, I don't go through malolactic fermentation, or my Napa Valley Chardonnay, I don't go through malolactic fermentation. And so the risk there is if you have any of this bacteria present inside the bottle, this secondary fermentation can actually occur in the bottle, and that produces a really awful result. So in the case of white wines or any wine, all of my red wines go through malolactic fermentation, so I don't have to worry about it. But in the case of the white wines or the rosé wine that don't go through malolactic fermentation, I make the decision to filter those as well to make sure that there's no bacteria that can cause this fermentation to be in the bottle, and thereby avoid having any kind of quality control issue down the line in those specific wines. So anyway, to sum up, for Bordeaux varietals, it's avoiding filtration, and the wines are hardier and they can handle this Brettanomyces character should it develop in the bottle. Pinot Noirs, Syrahs, I don't want any of that character in the wine at all, because it takes on a more animal character than it does a leathery character in those varietals. So I filter. And then, of course, the wines that don't go through malolactic fermentation, filter so that I don't have a spot fermentation happening in my bottles and a quality control problem down the road. So really good questions too. Let's see if there are any other questions here. No, that's it for the questions. So if you think of anything else, send it along. I'm happy to continue to answer. I'm going to take another chance at the wine and see if I get another question in the meantime, and see how the wine is showing. Interestingly enough, it's a 50% new oak, and now what I get in the wine is I get a little bit more of the oak character. And in this case, it's more like a sweetness, like a toffee, a little bit of a butterscotch type character in the nose. And let's see the taste profile. And the taste profile, I see the wine is just much more expansive than it was when I first opened it. And I get more of that kind of sweet toffee-ish character that I pointed out in the nose. I get a little bit of that in the mouth, like on the sides as well. So still showing nicely. I think I'll take this bottle home and I'll see how it tastes tomorrow. And I'm pretty sure it's going to be even more fantastic tomorrow than it is right now. All right, so hope you get a chance to enjoy this wine. Let me see if there's any last minute questions. And it doesn't look like it. So with that, I'm going to sign off, but I'm going to say thank you very much for one question came in. How will you store at home over the next 24 hours? I live in an area where it doesn't get too hot in the evening, so I'm just going to put the cork in it and then just leave it on the counter and see what it's like tomorrow. And hopefully, it didn't warm up while it was there, just sitting on the counter, and then see what it's like. So I'm not going to stick it in the fridge. I know I'm going to consume it tomorrow at some point, and so I'll just kind of let it sit at room temperature and see what it does. And then, have you seen any interesting climate characteristics change during COVID? Well, let's see. What I've noticed about the climate, not necessarily temperatures or anything like that, but what I've noticed is the wildlife, and the birds are just much more active now than I ever noticed before. I don't know if that's going to be good or bad. Birds can be an issue when the grapes are getting ripe because they want to eat them. If we go back to the beginning of the presentation, I was talking about what the vines are trying to do. The birds are really happy to start eating the grapes when they're ripe. So right now, there's just a lot of birds in general. I notice them at my house when I wake up in the morning. They're loud, and even here at the winery, they're all over the place. So I think if there's anything that's happened with the COVID situation is just wildlife being a little bit more active maybe than it's been in the past. So let's see if there's anything else that came in. Nope, that's it. Well, somebody's having, why are some producers discouraged from growing Merlot and Napa? I don't know if you addressed this earlier. I think that there are a couple of issues there. One is that Cabernet just is a much easier grape to deal with around here. I would say the easiest answer or the quickest answer is the economics. Growers can make a lot more money from Cabernet than they can out of Merlot, or any other varietal. To give you an idea, top-end Cabernet in the Napa Valley goes for $10,000 plus, if not 13 plus a ton. And that's a lot for Cabernet. If we think about high-end Pinot Noir in Napa, that's closer to $6,500, and then the other varietals might be somewhere in between. And we're talking about on the top end. We're talking about the average end. You can buy Cabernet for $8,000 a ton, but everything else is going to be a couple thousand, 3,000, 3,500 a ton. So if you're a grower and you're thinking about what varietal can I make the most money from, you're going to want to plant Cabernet Sauvignon over Merlot. And then with Merlot, haven't gotten the bad rap because of the movie. A lot of growers saw a little bit of pushback from people buying Merlot, and they didn't want it anymore because they couldn't sell their Merlot anymore. They needed Pinot. And so I think the biggest pushback is exactly that. And unfortunately, there's some areas that would be more prime for Merlot than they would be for Cabernet Sauvignon, but they're planted to Cabernet Sauvignon. And whereas they can make a really top end Merlot, they're making just an average Cabernet Sauvignon. But I think the main reason is we want to think that it's this romantic approach to growing grapes and making wine, but at the end of the day, there's some real economics behind it, and the desire, to maximize what you can do with your land in terms of the money you can make from what you grow. I think that's the main point about it. And again, in terms, not just because of how much you can buy a Cabernet or sell Cabernet for, but also the amount of work that Cabernet needs is it's a varietal that requires just not as much labor as some of these other varietals. It basically grows itself around here. It's kind of like a weed. And then from Pedro, any recommendations from Valle de Guadalupe? Well, I think that's a really fascinating area. That's been getting a lot of press lately. And I would say from the wines that I've had down there, the ones that really stand out to me in terms of varietals, I really like the Tempranillos down there. I think the climate in that region being a little bit warmer than it is here, those types of varietals make a really powerful wine that does really, really well. I think there's some interesting Bordeaux varietals there, but maybe require a little bit more work. I was really impressed with Chenin Blanc from down there too, which I wasn't prepared to find white wines necessarily down there that I was going to enjoy, but I was really impressed with Chenin Blanc. But I would say if I had to pick a red, it would be Tempranillo, closely followed by maybe Syrah or some other varietals similar to those growing areas in Europe. So maybe Grenache or Carignan are interesting, and then the white wine definitely would be Chenin Blanc of the ones that I had. All right, let's see if there's any other questions, and let's see. That's it, I think. All right. Well, you guys, we were successful in talking about Merlot for almost an hour, which I'm really proud of. I was a little thinking about, how are we going to spend the hour together? And I'm glad that there were plenty of questions from you. And I really enjoy doing these, and I enjoy the exchange between the two, me and you guys asking the questions. And I hope you guys will join me next week when we do another one of these. I think we're doing red wine, really older wine, 2009. And I look forward to describing that wine to you. And in the meantime, if you think of some questions, write them down and let's talk next week. So thanks to you guys, and have a nice rest of your Thursday afternoon, and we'll see you soon. Thank you so much.